Careful, your dog stops eating, hides under the bed, stares at you with an expression you have never quite seen before. 2 days later, it is gone. Everyone around you says the same thing. It knew, somehow it knew, but did it really? Or are you doing what humans always do, projecting a very human understanding of mortality onto a creature whose inner world you can never fully enter? Careful, the answer turns out to be far stranger than a simple yes or no, and it says as much about how animal minds actually work as it does about how badly you want to believe your dog understood the end was coming. Start with what actually happens biologically in the final days and hours of an animal's life, because the behavior itself is not in question. Veterinarians and animal behaviorists have documented consistent patterns across many species. Careful, dogs and cats often withdraw, seek out quiet, hidden spaces, stop eating, and become less responsive to their environment as death approaches. Researcher Mark Beckhoff, an ethologist who has spent decades studying animal emotion and cognition, has written extensively about these end-of-life behavior changes, noting that they appear reliably enough that experienced veterinarians can often predict how close an animal is to death simply by observing them. So the behavior is real. Careful, the question is what it actually represents. Here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because there is a meaningful difference between an animal responding to physical decline and an animal understanding the abstract concept of its own mortality. Physical decline is measurable. Organs failing produce specific sensations, specific hormonal shifts, specific changes in how the body processes energy and pain. Careful, an animal whose body is shutting down would naturally seek safety, conserve energy, and withdraw from activity, not because it comprehends death as a concept, but because every physical signal available to it says something is deeply wrong, and safety is the priority. This distinction matters enormously, and it connects to a broader question researchers have wrestled with for decades. Careful, do animals possess something psychologists call mortality salience, an awareness that they as individuals will eventually cease to exist? This is different from fear of an immediate threat, which almost every animal demonstrates constantly. A gazelle that flees a lion is responding to imminent danger, not contemplating the eventual end of its life story. Fear of dying right now and understanding that you are, as an abstract fact, mortal are two very different cognitive achievements. Careful, researchers studying this question have found surprisingly little solid evidence that most animals possess true mortality salience in the way humans experience it. Careful, psychologist Jesse Bering, who has written extensively on the evolution of death awareness, has argued that a genuine concept of personal mortality, understanding that your specific individual existence will end and grappling with that as an abstract future fact, appears to require a fairly sophisticated capacity for mental time travel. The ability to imagine yourself in a future that does not include you. Careful, this kind of projection seems to be rare, and possibly even unique in the animal kingdom. But here's the twist, and it complicates everything. A small number of species show behaviors that make researchers pause and reconsider how confident they should be in that conclusion. Elephants are the most striking example. Researchers including Joyce Poole and other elephant behavior specialists have documented what is often called elephant grief behavior in extraordinary detail. Careful, elephants have been observed returning repeatedly to the bones of deceased herd members, gently touching skulls and tusks with their trunks, standing vigil near a dying or recently deceased companion for extended periods, and displaying behaviors that closely resemble what humans would call mourning. This does not necessarily prove elephants understand death as an abstract universal concept the way humans do. Careful, but it strongly suggests they recognize something significant and irreversible has happened to a specific individual they cared about, which is a meaningfully different kind of awareness than simple biological withdrawal. Great apes offer another compelling data point. Primatologists studying chimpanzee behavior have documented cases where mothers carry the bodies of deceased infants for days, sometimes over a week, before finally releasing them. Careful, researchers studying these cases, including work published by primatologist James Anderson, have suggested this behavior may reflect a gradual process of recognizing that something has fundamentally and permanently changed, even without a human-like conceptual framework for death itself. So where does this leave the question of whether your dog somehow knew? The most scientifically honest answer looks something like this. Careful, your dog almost certainly did not comprehend death as an abstract concept, the way you understand your own mortality when you think about the distant future, but your dog's body was flooding with signals that something was fundamentally wrong. Declining organ function, changes hormone levels, changes in smell caused by shifting body chemistry are often detectable by animals with far more sensitive olfactory systems than yours. Careful, reduced energy, pain, and internal systems failing all produce a coordinated behavioral response that looks from the outside remarkably like knowing. This reframes the entire question in an important way. Careful, the behavior you interpreted as your dog understanding death may actually be something more like your dog's body understanding decline and translating that decline into behaviors, seeking safety, seeking solitude, conserving energy, that happen to look exactly like what a creature aware of its own mortality might do. There's a deeper insight buried in this distinction, and it says something about how easily humans project their own cognitive experience onto other minds. Careful psychologists call this anthropomorphism, the tendency to attribute human mental states, motivations, and understanding to non-human animals. It is not a flaw exactly. Researchers studying human cognition suggest that this tendency likely evolved because assuming other minds work similarly to your own is often a useful shortcut for predicting behavior. Careful, but it can also lead you to overinterpret an animal's experience, layering a story of conscious understanding onto behavior that may have a much simpler biological explanation. This does not mean the emotional experience you had watching your dog change in its final days was wrong or foolish. The grief and connection were real. What may not have been accurate is the specific story you told yourself about what was happening inside your dog's mind. Careful, consider what this means for how you think about animal minds more broadly. The behaviors are consistent, the withdrawal, the seeking of quiet spaces, the changes in responsiveness, these happen reliably enough that veterinarians treat them as meaningful signals. Careful, but the internal experience behind those behaviors remains genuinely uncertain, and possibly unknowable in any complete sense, because you cannot climb inside another creature's consciousness and directly verify what it understands about its own existence. Here's where the story circles back to something almost uncomfortable. Careful. Humans are, as far as researchers can currently tell, one of the only species with clear evidence of grappling explicitly with the abstract fact of their own eventual death. This awareness shapes enormous portions of human psychology, culture, religion, and behavior. Anthropologist Ernest Becker famously argued that much of human civilization can be understood as an elaborate, mostly unconscious response to managing the terror of that awareness. Careful. Animals, as far as the evidence currently suggests, largely do not carry that particular burden. Their bodies respond to decline with precision and instinct, without the added psychological weight of contemplating the abstract meaning of their own ending. There is something worth sitting with in that difference. Your dog's final days were likely not haunted by an understanding of mortality the way yours might be someday. Its withdrawal was not despair about ceasing to exist. Careful, it was simply a body responding, as bodies do to systems shutting down, seeking comfort and safety in the only way biology knows how to ask for it. There's another layer to this worth exploring, and it involves a phenomenon some hospice caregivers and veterinarians describe as terminal lucidity, moments of unexpected alertness or apparent clarity that occasionally occur shortly before death in both humans and animals. Careful researchers studying this phenomenon, including work compiled by biologist Michael Naum, have documented cases where severely ill or declining individuals experience a brief period of apparent improvement, sometimes hours or even a day or two before death, only to decline rapidly afterward. The mechanism behind this remains poorly understood, and it is important to be cautious here, since much of the evidence is anecdotal rather than drawn from controlled studies. Careful, but if something like this does occur in animals as well as humans, it complicates the picture even further. It suggests that whatever is happening biologically in the final stretch of life is not a simple, steady decline, but something more complex, with the body sometimes producing brief windows of apparent alertness that caregivers can easily misread as an animal somehow sensing or preparing for the end in an unusually direct way. Careful, it is also worth considering how differently this question plays out across species with very different sensory worlds. Careful, a dog's experience of its own decline is shaped enormously by smell, a sense so dominant in canine cognition that researchers studying canine olfaction, including work by neuroscientist Gregory Burns using MRI imaging on awake dogs, have found that the region of a dog's brain associated with smell processing is proportionally much larger than the equivalent region in the human brain. Careful, this means a dog navigating its final days is likely experiencing an intensely detailed chemical picture of its own bodily changes, one that a human simply has no comparable access to. Careful, what looks to you like your dog staring blankly at nothing may actually reflect an animal deeply immersed in a flood of internal sensory information you cannot perceive at all, information that has nothing to do with abstract thoughts about mortality and everything to do with a nervous system responding to real-time biological data. This raises a broader point about the limits of trying to answer this question definitively at all. Careful consciousness researchers studying animal cognition generally acknowledge that verifying subjective inner experience in any non-human creature remains one of the hardest problems in science, sometimes referred to as the problem of other minds. You can observe behavior, you can measure hormone levels, brain activity, and physiological stress responses. What you cannot do with current tools is directly access what an animal subjectively experiences as those changes unfold. Careful, this is not a temporary gap waiting for better technology to fill. Some philosophers of mind argue it may be a fundamentally unbridgeable gap, since objective experience by definition is not the kind of thing that can be observed from the outside, only inferred. Consider both halves of the truth at once. The behavior was real, and it was not imagined. Careful, but what it represented was almost certainly something quieter and more physical than a conscious confrontation with death, a body speaking in the only language it has while you watching from the outside filled in the rest with a very human story about knowing, because that is the only way you know how to understand an ending like this at all.